Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today we're going to be talking about global justice, and we have four guests joining us. Let me introduce you to them. One here in the studio is our old friend Arnaud Kurze. Arnaud is an associate professor of justice studies at Montclair State University and a Wilson Center Global Fellow. Also with us, the co-author of the book we'll be talking about, Christopher Lamont. Chris is an assistant dean and an associate professor of international relations at the Institute for International Strategy at Tokyo International University. That's the city he's joining us from today. Thanks for keeping a late night for us, Chris. Also, Sarine Karajerjian. She is a program director for the environmental politics at the Arab Reform Initiative. She joins us from Beirut. And last but not least is Franz Baumann. Franz is a former Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations, and he joins us from Vienna. A hearty Wilson welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. So the book we're talking about, just hot off the presses from Arnaud and Chris, is this book. It's titled Mapping Global Justice, Perspectives, Cases, and Practices. So we'll begin with a little general discussion of the book, and then we'll involve Franz and Sarine in the discussion. Arnaud, welcome. Great to see you as always.
Thank you for having me here, and it's always a pleasure being on the show and having these esteemed guests today.
Yeah, terrific lineup. Thank you. So tell us a bit about the book. One of the things that you say in the notes about the book is to create a better understanding of the process, actors, and tools available to face the challenges of achieving global justice, which is a big challenge.
Indeed, as you say. And the problem here is global justice has been sort of niched into sort of a scholarship, I'd say, and a practice that was oftentimes about distributive justice and social inequalities at the
Define distributive justice. I'm not going to assume that all of our viewers know what that means.
So this idea that economic wealth is sort of concentrated in one area. That's why we have sort of the discussions about the global north and the global south. And what Chris and I try to do with this book is really revisit some of these entrenched notions and really talk about justice from a broader perspective. And today we'll be mostly focusing on the environmental or green justice part, especially with our climate crisis. Mm-hmm. But again, it spans to over conflict, the economy, gender, LGBT rights. And so that was a really striking effort that we put together here to trying to tackle this and look at it from a holistic perspective.
Chris, tell us, when people think about the attempt to achieve global justice, we talk about the fact that we're not there, right? What are the barriers? What are the things that you and Arnaud have identified in the book that make it difficult to come up with a shared standard that can be essentially worked toward?
One of the barriers I think that Arnaud and I discussed in the book was, as Arnaud kind of hinted at, is the siloed nature of justice practice and also scholarship that's out there. And what we mean by that is that often you have international justice efforts, but they're narrow and they're focused on particular aspects of justice. So you might think about things like the development of international war crimes tribunals and international criminal law that can deal with a certain type of injustice, but also doesn't really equip us to deal with the types of broader injustices such as inequality and environmental harm. So what we need and what we present the case for in this book is a more holistic understanding of justice and engagement with justice issues.
When people think about barriers or obstacles, what comes into play most frequently? You could think of certain cultural things. At the extremes, you think of the difference between, say, Sharia law and laws in Western nations. But also politics comes into play, where countries don't want to admit that they're doing anything wrong. Is there a way to break this down in terms of what becomes the greatest impediment to an international agreement on what constitutes justice and how to achieve it?
Yeah, John, that is a great question. I think a striking example here would be the talks about OPEC right now, right? Where the OPEC countries said, we're deciding about the output. We know what's best for us. And the U.S., the Biden administration saying like, you need to change your course for the better of the world, and of course the world being the US as a leading power. And so I think both sides, whether that's the OPEC countries or the US, have a bit of a learning curve here, because the problem is thinking collectively. And by thinking collectively, we need to think about those who are weak. And when Hans Jonas, a German-born American philosopher, came out with his Das Prinzip Verantwortung, or the imperative of responsibility, and has been sort of adjusted more recently. I think the key question here is, while we all have an individual responsibility, be that as a state leader or very much at a community level, I think the key here is to provide access to those who cannot act. Take the climate change issues, for instance. Someone that sits on an island in Micronesia has not the ability to fight climate change by themselves.
Yes.
So we need to act together.
Chris, talk to us about one of the things that you and Arnaud write about is the emergence of the human rights agenda. And talk to us about how that factors into this equation where, you know, at one point it was very narrow, things like you don't torture people, but now it's expansive in a way where we talk about things like environmental justice.
Absolutely. And one of the things that the human rights field was quick to recognize was the interdependence of human rights. And you hear this language a lot within the United Nations, that you can't realize one basket of rights, and rights are not, in a sense, a la carte. You don't just take some while not providing others. Mm-hmm. And so this holistic, and we say holistic here to give some context, things like economic, social, and cultural rights, and alongside the kind of traditional basket of rights that kind of people in the US, Americans, would consider to be rights as well.
So Arnaud, you mentioned environmental justice. We've touched on it a few times. You have two guests with us today who can speak to that with authority. When we talked about putting this session together, you wanted to find people out there who are rolling up their sleeves and involved in the types of things that you're talking about. Tell us why you selected the two people that are joining us
Yes,
today.
by all means. As I mentioned to you earlier, it was actually Sarine who brought it up because she is now the program director of environmental politics at the AIRB Reform Initiative, and it is crucial that we look at these issues in these countries that have been long colonized and put sort of this environmental issue at the back burner in a hope to promote development and sort of a better well-being, whether that's public health and conflict-free areas. But what is really important to note here is that these issues all interrelate, and there's no better place and person who really incarnates that as well, which is my dear colleague Franz Baumann, who works with me at New York University. And I think having had the responsibility to be in charge of peace operations, but also the environment, shows that the impact on both ends of the spectrum is very important. And Chris and I in the book, of course, put multiple layers on there. And so I'm very excited that we got to share our thoughts from also a more practitioner-oriented and advocacy side. So
great. And we're going to hear from them now. And so, Chris, I would offer to you, and Arnaud, if you have any questions as we progress in the discussion, please just jump in with those. Sarine, let's begin with you. If you would talk to us about the type of work you're doing in the context of what we're talking about, this search for global justice and justice standards.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Arnaud, for the invitation. I think it's as Chris and both Arnaud brought it up, you can't talk today about environment without talking about social justice, without talking about the inequalities that we are actually going through and we're living. So as part of my job, if we can say, or my everyday struggle, or our team's everyday struggle, is to really look and answer these questions. One is, who is responsible for these inequalities? Two is, who will actually pay the price when it comes to access to resources? I mean, we live in a country like Lebanon, but we're also discussing issues globally. And everything we do at the local level affects us at the global level, and vice versa. I mean, we've seen it with the pandemic. If an epidemic starts somewhere, it affects, or a disease starts somewhere, it affects the global world, but yet the impact of it is affects it differently, specifically from the global south. So our work within the Arab Reform Initiative is to really look at and answer these questions as with a big P when we say environmental politics. So we've created this program 1.5 years ago as politics as really who is governing and who is responsible for managing and who's really accountable for the environmental injustices that we are going through in our region. Two is how do activists and local actors, whether in the region, actually mobilize? And this is where we've created this community of practice, we say, and we have to push for more South-South collaboration, where activists, scholars, journalists really work together and share data. And this is something that also was mentioned in the book. I mean, the data and finding data is really challenging and very critical in this region. And we also look at conflict and how conflict affects the environment and vice versa. I mean, at the moment with the Ukraine war, we're seeing a lot of maps as where is the oil spill is happening or where an environmental disaster is happening. But we don't see this in the war in Syria, nor in Libya, nor in Palestine, nor in Iraq or Yemen. So why is this the case? So how can we as a program as well, this is what we're doing, represent these voices, the voices that are unheard at the moment, and those voices will be the most affected by the climate change and by the global injustices that are continuing and has been happening for many centuries now, and more in the years to come.
On a humanitarian level, what you described, you would assume there would be no pushback, right? But you use the word you need to push because clearly there's resistance. Where are you finding the resistance when you're actually in the field?
I mean, you look at how the regimes of our region. I mean, we live in a region that is completely, authoritarian regimes, and being. I mean, you can't even use the word activist. Sometimes we tend to use the word advocates because you want to protect the rights of the people on the ground, as well as, I mean, the harassment towards activists in Iraq. We've seen this in Yemen as well, and other parts of the Arab region. But as well as there are other lessons we can learn from other parts from Latin America to Asia to other parts. I mean, this is where the concept of climate justice is going and moving towards. And Arnaud and Chris mentioned it in their book about the environmental movements. And these movements are not new, and they've existed in the 70s and 80s in the US. I mean, we've seen this with the concept of just transition in the 80s, and now more and more we're transitioning towards a new type of food, new type of energy, moving away from fossil fuel. But who will be affected the most from these new energy policies? Specifically the one that extractive policies that, as well as mentioned in the book, that we are seeing in North Africa, specifically because of the war in Ukraine, and more European countries being much more dependent on gas and oil coming from North African countries and other parts of the region. And we're seeing this in Algeria, which is one of the largest gas producer and exporter to Europe, let alone Morocco, Tunisia, and other places in the North Africa. So yeah, there is a push, but yet, it's both on both sides of the Mediterranean, if we can say. So from Europe, but as well as from the global South, but as well as from the global North.
Thanks, Sarine. Franz, we're going to come to you in a minute, but I think that, Arnaud, you have a follow-up for Sarine.
Yeah, no, for Franz, because Sarine
okay.
really laid out the nice regional part, and I think Franz, having had this long experience at the United Nations and having sort of had to work in different conflict zones, maybe you wanna share some of your cases that you've come across, and I know you're very much an advocate and a supporter for fighting climate change, and so it'll be great to hear from that international organizational level to sort of round this all up here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, very briefly, what I was dealing with in my last job at the United Nations in 2015 was a program was called Greening the Blue. Blue meaning the blue helmets. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It was a matter of walking the walk. That peacekeepers in Africa, fragile countries, Mali, Sudan, Central Africa, Congo, were not in an imperialist fashion burning fossil fuels flying around in airplanes, using a lot of water in arid areas. So Greening the Blue was a program of internal credibility, if you will. But let me tie this to the bigger subject where the UN has been part of the climate discussion since 1988. The first General Assembly resolution on, it was still called climate change, and it was also saving the future of mankind. It didn't say humankind. Mankind was in December 1988. And I followed it, and I was partially involved also in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Now, and this goes back to the question about the barriers to global justice. The barriers to global justice are that it's so incredibly difficult. Global heating is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. It is technically put an unprecedented global public policy responsibility. And when I say unprecedented, and from a justice point of view, and that's why I found the book so stimulating, opening avenues that I sort of sensed but had not really thought about. And what makes the climate issue so terrifically difficult from a justice point of view, like slavery or the reparations of slavery, is that the origins of global heating go back 250 years to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That, in other words, the wealth of the North, whether it is in North America, Canada, US, Europe, Japan, Australia, is essentially because we have burned hundreds of millions years worth of plant matter, dug it up and burned it. And that is causing the global heating. Now, collectively, industrialized countries, those that I've mentioned, have contributed 75 or 76% to global heating, and developing countries, by the way, the UN still uses the terminology developing, developed, even in the global COP26 Glasgow Pact. That is the terminology. So developing countries have contributed 24% and developed country 76%. So that is the justice issue. Are those inhabitants of the global North, that clearly us, who we all benefited from the burning of fossil fuel by our ancestors, what is our responsibility in terms of global justice? And in the UN context, there's a concept called common but differentiated responsibility. It's a common responsibility to save human civilization, but it's differentiated because Africa has contributed absolutely nothing and is now a major victim of global heating. So how to transform justice, how to implement justice when you have to go back 250 years, that is why this is one of the major barriers, because it is not just a matter of evil today, it is a matter of historical responsibility. So at the UN, and we see this in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2 weeks from now, these discussions will be had. I'm sorry to say there are no clear-cut answers, and it is a muddling through, but the issues of justice, and that's why I'm grateful for the book, is to articulate it. It's not a technical issue only of decarbonization. It is profoundly an issue of justice, of global justice, and of responsibility, last word, for the future. We're not only talking about people who are alive today. What is happening in the next couple of years will shape the life of all future generations. And so that is on our shoulders too.
Franz, I want to, you raise some giant questions, and the nature of the challenges are enormous. I want to ask each of you this, but begin with you from the perspective of someone who has worked with the UN so intimately. The dream, the hope of the UN is that it's a place where the nations of the world can come together and work things out, build consensus. Where are the trend lines headed in that regard? Are we living in a world that is moving toward more or less cooperation as it relates to justice, or any of the types of issues and challenges we face?
I fear, and I hope I'm wrong, but I fear we're moving in the wrong direction. The UN was founded in 1945 on the principle of compromise. And for me as a German, and Chris as a Japanese, we were treated leniently and there was no victor's justice, and we were readmitted to the community of civilized states. So the UN was based on the idea of compromise, of peaceful resolution of conflict. And so those principles have now been violated so egregiously. Robert Kagan called it "the jungle is growing back." And I fear that is the correct metaphor. So, and it's not just the Russian, which is the most egregious violation, but there were others in the past, mainly by the 3 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, China, and Russia. Surprisingly not in the last 30 years by France and Britain, that have not issued or used their veto in 30 years. But I think generally the rules of the international order are fragile and are not being improved by the situation in Eastern Europe. And it pains me greatly because I think the war in Ukraine is actually a sideshow. We have to save the future of civilization. And this is a distraction that will only undermine further people's belief in the rule of law. I hope not, but I see particularly the UN, which never had any enforcement power. It was a norm entrepreneur. It could get people together to agree to things, whether human rights, children's rights, or the Paris Agreement or the Agenda 2030. So it could negotiate solutions, but it could not enforce them. And so I simply hope that in the next couple of months, the value of multilateral cooperation, red lights, traffic lights slow down some drivers of high-speed cars, but essentially the traffic flows better if you have traffic lights. And that is the multilateral system, and hopefully people will understand it, that the system is measured by those who comply, not by those who violate the norms.
Sarine, a similar question. Thank you, Franz. Even though I thought the answer might go in that direction, my hope, keep hope alive. I thought there might be something positive for us to look at as well. Sarine, in regard, you mentioned authoritarian regimes. You're living in a region that is filled with them. What do you see in terms of trend lines in regards to this topic of the search for justice? Do you see any glimmers of hope? Is it coming from the grassroots? What do you see?
All right. I mean, to continue on what Franz was saying, I think also related to the book, it's a wonderful piece because it really gives us the history of justice and the global justice from a multiple angle, and going back to the environmental justice, and that we're going through now. We're hosting in the region 2 conference of the parties. One will be in less than 7 days in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the next year will be in the UAE. So what is the hope actually that we can aim for? And even if we aim for having hope, I mean, we're living in a country where there is no electricity, a cholera crisis in the moment in Lebanon, in Syria. We've seen it in Yemen as well. I mean, these are like causes of poverty. So where is actually the hope in what we're going through? We do still hope, and that's why I'm still living here, me and others probably, that are still thinking that we should continue to strive and continue to fight for our rights, and at the same time continue to really challenge the current status quo that we are going through. But yet I think the power of collective work, and this is something, again, it's mentioned in the book, but it's something that we should be pushing even much more. It's to work more together in the global south, to share knowledge and experiences, and to really use different platforms for critical mind and aspiring for change. This is our only raison d'être If not, why are we still here in this region?
Chris, I know that in the book you and Arnaud avoided being prescriptive, and you wanted to stimulate thinking about this with challenging questions and other things of that nature. But you also hope that people are going to have these discussions and come up with alternative solutions. Where do you see the greatest potential for that type of conversation to take place and those types of solutions to emerge?
This is a great question. And I think this builds a little bit on some of Franz's pessimism, but also Sarine's observations in terms of the fact that right now we're kind of on the wrong trajectory in terms of how we conceive of interests, state interests, right? In terms of short-term, but also anachronistic understandings of interest at a time when we are all globally faced with a kind of cataclysmic catastrophe that does have asymmetric costs, that some regions will feel the costs greater in the short term than others, but at the same time it's something that's going to affect all of us. And through advocacy and through education, through the book, right, we hope that there's a broader conversation about what is in our interests going forward that moves beyond some of the kind of the hard security questions that have begun to take the focus off of climate change and issues surrounding the environment, such as sitting here in Tokyo. If you think about kind of security issues that the government is currently most concerned about, right, those answers will include things like North Korea, kind of situation in the Taiwan Straits, etc., as opposed to some of the broad global issues that we highlight in this text. So kind of rethinking the interest.
Thanks. Arnaud, you know, in the notes on your book and in your opening comments, you talked about this goal of bridging the gap between theory and practice. When you think about that, right, it's a big task. The Wilson Center's mission is largely reflective of that, right? Bringing policymakers and academics together to pollinate the thinking. Talk about it in the concept of the book and what you and Chris have put forward. How do you think about that challenge of going from theoretical to in the trenches practice?
Yeah, indeed, and that's why you always have me back, because I love this institution where you need to sit down and learn about the past, right? Because knowledge is power, but power comes also with the responsibility. And so how can we put that knowledge into practice? And I think rather than looking at it as with, a silver lining at the horizon or a pessimistic outlook, I think pragmatism is the word here. And I think an example here would be how, for instance, the EU has put forward environmental education. It wasn't through goodwill. It was actually by roping in oftentimes entrepreneurs and so that the private sector into complying with regulations. And so cap and trade is a great example. Is it a great model? I believe not, because we're trying to say, hey, I polluted a little less, you can buy my rights off me, and we're all fine. It's not a great solution, but in sort of a dystopia where we're about to ruin our planet and hence the future of humanity, I think the important point is making baby steps, and I think whether that is from the top-down level at the level where, as Franz said, we have international actors and organizations that try to work together, but it seems like they're very entrenched and polarized. Bringing that conversation back and hopefully using these books in an higher education setting, but also with regards to a center such as the Wilson Center, and then what Sarine mentioned with regards to sort of more advocacy-driven groups. I think it's bringing these key stakeholders together and then start a conversation, because it's only through conversation and understanding that we can take these steps together. And it requires compromise and sort of marathon style thinking that requires commitment.
And that would be a fantastic final thought, but I'm going to step on it and ask each of you one final question, even though I should take the nice tidy package when it's presented to me, but somehow I'm going to not. And here's why, right? When you talk about, this is an important topic and an important book, and it raises gigantic questions that cannot be adequately addressed in the short time that any format provides, because what we're really talking about is an ongoing discussion, right? It doesn't begin or end here. So because all of you know infinitely more than I know about the topic, what I thought we could do is for a quick final thought from each of you, and we'll go in reverse order of introduction, mix it up, and just something maybe that we haven't talked about yet that you think is important to add to the conversation, or maybe some suggestion for further reading, anything of that nature, what you would do at that time available. And maybe if you take about 30 seconds each for a final closing thought. And Franz, we'll begin with you.
Thank you so much. Now, I need a bit more than 30 seconds because I have to tell you that
Take it.
Actually the crisis, the climate crisis, is the result of a phenomenal success story. And that makes it so difficult. So in the last 2 generations, life expectancy has shot up. 100 years ago, 60% of children died before the age of 5. So now we are pushing nearly 8 billion people, many of whom, not all, but many, have a very good, decent life in dignity that was unthinkable in the past. So what we are seeing, the climate change, is the flip side of a tremendous success story. And that makes it very difficult to have a silver bullet solution and say that's how we fix it. Because essentially is turning a success story into paying the price for what underlied that success story. And that is one more thought, if I'm allowed. Inequality, it is no longer the issue between poor countries in Africa and rich countries, because the rich in Rio de Janeiro or in New York or in Lagos actually have the same 2-car garages and have the same lifestyles. It is the poor in all these countries that are actually contributing nothing, but that are suffering. In the world, the bottom 50% of the population emit about 1.2 tons per year. The top 10% emit 29 tons. So we have massive inequality issues that are also touched upon in the book. So having this conversation, talking about things that are not just technical, not just legal, not just moral, but are also economical. So the complexity of the situation, bringing that out, I think you have done very well. And I think that is a contribution. You might not have a solution, but you cannot have a solution without a profound understanding as to the complexity of the issues.
Terrific, thank you. You know, and justice can be elusive, but the injustice that you describe is pretty darn obvious. And Sarine, you're up next. A quick thought.
Yes, and I mean, building on that, I think it's very important to, always remember our history. It has always been, the responsibility is on the Western world that has its own industrial revolution. And how can now the global South, that is not only called developing world, because we're shifting away from using these developing words, and really understand how can we work together. I think this is what, when it comes to social justice and inequalities, is really to capture the different players and to really understand who is really influential. And this is something that we've been doing now much more in our organization, is to mapping, like Arnaud and Chris did, a mapping on the environmental actors, and to see how can you influence and how can you bring on board advocates to push with you for changes, for reforms, for more social, for just policies that can be implemented for everyone. I think this is one thing. And the other, I would say, the voices, giving voices and platforms to youth. I mean, there's a huge population from our region here. It's like 60% is below the age of 35. And most of them don't want to live in the region. They want to live outside because of these inequalities, because of unemployment, because of fear that the war is coming. is here around the corner. Fear that we don't have electricity, fear that we're going to live in poverty or die of a health malfunctioning, or so I think this is important to look at these voices and who they are and how are they represented in international negotiations, but also giving them voices and platform that they are also important.
Thanks. Christopher.
Thank you. I would say one last thought that I would leave us with would be a kind of forward-looking one that we do touch on in the book a little bit, and that's the impact going forward of emerging technologies and digital spaces on justice debates. And on the one hand, there's a perception that, well, if it's in the cloud, right, it's clean. But on the other hand, there is a lack of appreciation for the environmental consequences of the mining of rare earth minerals, geographically, kind of which countries where this mining is largely concentrated. And also the second question is thinking about kind of this new data that's being generated in terms of justice, and kind of where is this data, who holds this data, and how this will shape future debates in justice going forward.
Thank you. And Arnaud, you gave a terrific closing remark, and now I'm going to ask you to give us another one.
It's fine. Thank you, John. I think I just wanted to highlight that oftentimes policies are reactionary in nature, and I think we need to rethink that. And by rethinking our way forward and how we can make this a better livable place for all of us, I think raising these voices that are sometimes invisible or marginalized for a reason or another are really important. And I think every one of us here captured that really nicely, whether that is at the multinational or multilateral level at the UN, or in a regional or communal and community serving setting. I think that's important. Respect and then listening, and hopefully by taking baby steps, change will be on the horizon.
Thank you. I want to thank Franz Baumann, Sarine Karajerjian, Christopher Lamont, Arnaud Kurze. This is the book, Mapping Global Justice. Don't just settle for our Cliff Notes discussion. Read the book as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon on. Till then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for being here.